this is partly an introduction for me to other folks here at UCF, and then also to our broader audience. So I'm an assistant professor with an asterisk, associate professor in the fall in physics, and I'm in the planetary sciences group. So we're really focused on planetary sciences, and my expertise is on lunar and asteroidal surfaces. I'm also the deputy PI for the Center for Lunar and Asteroid Surface Science, or CLASS, which is a NASA funded node that's part of the Solar System Exploration Virtual Research Institute. Too many acronyms, sorry. But this is an institute that's put together of groups around the country. They're really focused on lunar and asteroid surface science, or lunar and asteroid science, from a lot of different perspectives. And then I also work in the Center for Microgravity Research on campus, which is a set of labs we have in the physics department. This is a template for these talks that suggested listing some of these research focuses and teaching focuses. My big focus is on dust charging and dynamics on planetary surfaces. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So that was why I was happy to see the question about dust mitigation and charging in the chat. This also is relevant to things like planet formation, ring formation, and planetary systems. And then the other aspect of this that I work on is in plasma interactions. So looking at what are the origins of the charges of the particles on these surfaces, how do they interact with plasma environments in space, both on planetary surfaces, but also on spacecraft surfaces. My teaching covers a variety of areas, including introductory physics and astronomy courses. I'm working on expanding some of our course offerings for both planetary and astro undergrads, as well as working with some folks to develop some cross-department, potentially, programs that look at more hands-on training and capstone level courses that focus on experiment design and flying experiments and CubeSats and things like that. I'm also working on improving some of our hands-on course opportunities and our laboratory experiments opportunities in physics. So as I mentioned, I'm the deputy PI for CLASS, and I also was I am the PI of UCF's first flown CubeSat. It was called SurfSat. It launched in September 2018. I have received a decent amount of funding for parabolic and suborbital flights, and then I've also been involved in ISS flight experiments. So if there's microgravity environments where you can put a payload, I will take it. I've received a few of these listed awards for research that are focused really on the science and exploration. And there's a few links there in the top right that are some of the websites for some of our research, and I can post those in the chat too. And so I'll move on a little bit to talk about some of the science and exploration drivers of what I do. So my research is really driven by, and this is part of what Survey's goal is and part of what we do in CLASS, is the links between science and exploration. So I'm a physicist and a planetary scientist by training, but I'm really interested in how we can use exploration to enhance science, but then also use science to enhance exploration and see like those questions of dust and dust mitigation. They have really interesting questions of how does dust form on planetary surfaces and how does it behave and evolve? But then when we're doing these exploration projects, how does it interact with rovers or humans? So there's a lot of these really nice tie-ins between science and exploration drivers that can enhance and enable each other. And this is obviously really tied into a lot of what NASA is doing, and even more so right now with Artemis and CLIPS programs and the expanded focus on a presence on the moon, hopefully a sustained presence on the moon, and eventually to Mars. NASA took a little brief detour for a while to talk more about going to asteroids, and they're not as focused on that right now, but there is still interest within NASA of asteroids from a scientific perspective, also from a planetary defense perspective, in terms of understanding hazards from asteroids. And then there's also interest both within NASA and in the global community of asteroids as a resource potential. So for water, rare metals, things like that, right? There's potential uses of asteroids long-term for resources. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things on this slide that tie into what we look at when we're looking at opportunities for projects and how we justify some of this between science and exploration. So on the left is a completely unreadable chart, probably, that is NASA's technology taxonomy chart. You just Google that and you'll find this version and you can actually read it probably. But basically when you're looking at NASA proposals and when you're writing NASA proposals, you always have to justify what your relevance is to NASA. And so on the left here is if you're writing a proposal to like the technology development side of NASA, you want to say how you tie in to their different research areas. And this is really important for like SBIRs and STTRs and some of the other space technology mission directorate proposals. And there's a lot of different areas here on the left. It starts at propulsion and it ends up at guidance, navigation, control, but there's manufacturing and autonomy and a lot of different things in between. Some of those are more closely tied in with exploration, such as exploration destination systems, robotic systems, development of sensors. So those are some of the things that we often look at. But then also things like materials and structural manufacturing that are of interest to some folks in engineering, for instance, here that overlap with our scientific interests. So how do we build devices and build surfaces and manufacture things that are going to withstand lunar environments and then also be robust for those operations that you need. On the other hand, a lot of what I do obviously is look at the science side of things. And there's a lot of, typically when we are looking at these things, we look at things like the decadal surveys. So for the science side of NASA, planetary science, astronomy, different groups, heliophysics, all have what they call decadal surveys, right? That are these sort of long-term goals of what the community wants to push forward in the next 10-ish years that NASA tries to align their calls to. And if you can tie to those decadal surveys and those big long-term goals, it helps you with the funding opportunities. And then also recently they just released this Artemis Science Definition Team report, which is really focused on what science they want to get done with the Artemis mission, so the human lander moon missions. They are planning on integrating science from the beginning in these Artemis missions. And so there's a lot of interesting objectives that they're trying to meet. And this also ties to some of the CLPS missions. So all of the small lander, robotic lander missions are going to have science on board, the different payloads on board. So we can look at how these all tie together to explore the lunar surface and answer both fundamental science questions and also practical science questions, including understanding planetary processes, understanding how things work on the lunar surface and the characterization of volatiles. So understanding water, Andrew mentioned, is really important for lunar resources and long-term, probably sustained exploration on the moon and also beyond the moon. As well as a lot of some of the basic science of like understanding where we come from. The moon is a great witness plate for the impact history of the Earth and the inner solar system, and tells us a lot about that sort of past and evolution. And then you see at the bottom, there is that tie-in to mitigating exploration risks. So how can we do science and understand and characterize the surface and use that to help us mitigate exploration risks, such as lunar dust in your systems. And then just a really quick slide. I usually have about 10 slides in a talk on this, so I smooshed it all into one slide. So regolith or dust covers planetary surfaces, and it's typically dust is defined as the finest part of asteroidal or lunar or small body regolith that is built up over time. There's just some example pictures here. One of the big characteristics and why I study dust, because I promise space dust is interesting, right? But is because it is really applicable to all of these environments that we're thinking of exploring. So it's important on the moon, asteroids, and especially Mars, right? It's a little bit different when we look at dust on Mars, but it's still an issue. And this comes in whether we're talking about surface operations or landing or any of these environments. And you can see that picture in the bottom left is a picture of a zoomed in picture of a lunar dust particle that just shows how non-spherical and complicated these particles can be and why it makes it so hard to do simulations and even some experiments here on Earth just because of the complicated nature of lunar dust. The other side then of what I study is the plasma environment. Brief overview, and this is a sort of picture we use in a lot of things, but this brief overview, right, is that any surface in space is exposed to plasma environment. We don't have an atmosphere to protect most spacecraft or planetary surfaces. So they're exposed to solar wind, ions, electrons, higher energy particles, UV from the sun that causes photoemission from the surface. All of this creates a plasma environment at the surface of these bodies that can create electric fields. It can create different types of secondary and backscattering emission of electrons. And so operating in this challenging plasma environment is also something we have to consider, not only for how it affects the dust and the charged dust on the surface, but how it affects moving around on the surface and charge buildup and things like that. And then this is also important, obviously, for spacecraft orbiting Earth or anywhere else in space. So just really quickly, this is a slide showing some highlights of some of the experiments we do. I mentioned a lot of my work is understanding how all of this stuff behaves in microgravity. So really finding ways to do experiments in microgravity, low gravity environments. And we do that in a drop tower in our lab here at UCF. You can see that on the left. We do it on parabolic flights. So you can see a couple of pictures of that. And now more increasingly on suborbital flights with Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic. So these are really giving us different opportunities for different lengths of time in microgravity that allow you to do different types of experiments. Most of our stuff has to do with understanding dust behavior, but there's a huge variety of experiments done on all of these platforms. And I'd love to talk with folks more about that if you're interested. So finally, I just put up a couple of projects that we have going right now. The project on the left is actually a project that's going to fly on a suborbital flight later this year with Blue Origin that's looking, and it's funded through the NASA Flight Opportunities Program, that's looking at tribocharging and electrostatic behavior of dust in microgravity. So we're going to look at how charged dust behaves as it's moving in microgravity. And then also we're working with NASA Kennedy on some of their tribocharging sensors to measure sort of charge buildup on different types of surfaces as it rubs against dust. And this are sensors that could be put on rover wheels, on scoops, things like that, to really understand the behavior of charging on different materials that are interacting with the lunar surface or any other planetary surface. Some of what we do is also looking at landing and plume effects, so how dust interacts with the charged environment from rockets and landing. I have some collaborators here at UCF on that, as well as we're working with Mast and Space Systems and doing some testing with their rockets to test the sensors. The picture down on the bottom is from a drop tower experiment showing some cratering, even from a small little plume that we did. And then the video that maybe is playing, or maybe froze already, is just an experiment that's a series of experiments we have looking at regolith and particle behavior in microgravity that we've done on the ISS and some suborbital flights. And we have a follow-up project coming up on some parabolic flights in the fall that are going to be doing it in both microgravity and lunar environments to test some tools and other devices in lunar gravity regolith interactions. And I listed a few of the types of proposals here that we typically look at. They're from the Space Technology Mission Directorate and from the Science Mission Directorate of NASA. So they're very different types of programs. And there's lots of different calls in all of those. So it's an interesting ecosystem of proposing to NASA. So we have a number of, I have proposals, I think, in all of these, almost all of these categories that are in the works or have been submitted recently. So there's a lot of different programs available for funding for these types of things. And I'm happy to collaborate with additional folks here and who might be online on some of those. I think that is it. So I'll put it on my final slide